Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Frank Eibü-Poulsen. I hold a PhD in history from the European University in Florence, Italy. In this video, I'm presenting my analysis of a painting which you probably have seen before, as it represents a historical landmark, the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The painting is famous and has been used as an illustration for many book covers on human rights, the French Revolution, and other history books on the period or topic of liberty and republicanism. So it piqued my interest when I saw it used so often as an illustration for an argument or a period, and I wanted to understand its meaning by reading an analysis of its many allegories and symbols. And I was surprised to find out that there was no scholarly study dedicated to this painting. So that's what you would call a gap in the literature. So I did my own research, which was published as a peer-reviewed article. The link to the article, which is in open access, is in the description below if you want further details. By the way, this video is based on a presentation I did at the Venice Multidisciplinary World Conference on Republics and Republicanism in May 2024. First of all, it may come as a surprise to you that there are actually two paintings on the same subject. Both of them are attributed to the same artist, Jean-Jacques François Le Barbier. Here are the two paintings in question, which are not up to scale. The one on the left is actually larger than the one on the right. And the one on the right is probably the one that you're most familiar with, as it's the most famous one and often used in books and web pages or any illustration of the 1789 Declaration or the history of human rights. There is also a third version, which is actually similar to the second painting in the middle, and which is an engraving signed by Le Barbier as designer of the composition. At first, you may think that these are similar visual representations, but if you look a little more closely, you start seeing differences. One may wonder, why are there different versions? And why make two compositions that, although they seem similar, are different? Think of it as texts. If you are a lawyer, or if you used to read or watch legal dramas or thrillers, you very well know that each word and how each word is arranged in a sentence has a tremendous importance and can change the meaning of the legal text. Well, this is a legal text, literally. It is a declaration of rights, although it is a graphic visualization of this legal text. It is therefore not a coincidence which allegory appears and where and how, and the whole composition, layout, disposition creates an overall meaning. This visual language was known to the early modern viewer, just as the textual language. To us, this vocabulary and grammar is like a foreign language, and our task is to translate it and decipher its codes and hidden meanings. The first thing we turn to for information when looking at a painting in a museum is to look at its description in the notice underneath it. These two paintings are in the Musée Carnavalet in Paris. Up until its recent renovation, they were actually displayed next to one another, but since the reopening of the museum in 2021, only the version on the right, the more famous one, is displayed in the museum. I have checked myself as I visited the museum in 2021. The website of the Paris Musée writes, and I translate, that this is an allegorical composition, which is true, but then the description is not precise enough, even if partly true. The museum describes the figure on the left as monarchy holding the broken chains of tyranny, and on the right, the genius of the nation holding the scepter of power. They surround the preamble of the Declaration. Underneath, the tables of the Declaration of Rights with 17 articles are separated by the lictor's fasces, topped by a Phrygian hat. Above all these, the Freemason eye in the radiating triangle. It is not an accurate reading and very likely anachronistic to oppose monarchy and nation in interpreting the allegories. Firstly, the allegory on the left is monarchical France, and not just an allegory of the monarchy. And the crown symbolizes monarchy, but the fleur de lis on the coat of the allegory is the symbol of France, as present on the coat of arms until the end of monarchy, and the First Republic was declared in 1792. So there is already a big difference between interpreting the allegory as monarchy or monarchical France, as it is France as a country represented, albeit with a monarchical form of political regime. France also includes the people, so the nation in this sense, which leads to questioning the second allegory on the right. It is doubtful that it is an allegory of the nation, because this was, in political and legal terms, a completely new concept. So to help us, we can have a look at other representations of the declarations of the right of man and the citizen. First of all, if we look at the engraving that is comparable to the second painting, there is an explanation at the bottom. The point of engravings at the time was to facilitate the diffusion and propaganda of ideas. People would set up the engravings on the walls of their houses as ornaments, as they cost less than an actual painting. And often engravings would include text to explain complex allegories and composition to a public not well versed in art history and all its codes. So here in the explanation, we have confirmation that the allegory on the left is France, and there is not even a mention that it is monarchical France, because the engraving is from 1790, so no republic yet, even if there were hefty political discussions and divides already. The engraving's explanation continues by identifying on the right the allegory as, I quote, the law, which shows with its scepter the eye of supreme reason that dissipates the clouds of error that were darkening it. End of quotation. Now, you're probably acquainted with the allegory of the law, and this allegory does not fit the one you have in mind. Actually, looking at Dictionary of Emblems and contemporary descriptions of the allegory of the law at the time, this does not fit the allegory. Moreover, if we look at other representations of the declaration, like this one, which actually is a poor copy of the precedent one, the exact same allegory is now described as representing strength and virtue. Now, if we turn to the existing literature and the analysis of the declarations by Le Barbier, we find surprisingly little. There are partial studies of the declaration which either only focus on one allegory or take for granted the explanation provided in the engraving about the law. Or a third possibility, we can find a lot of information about Le Barbier, for instance with Jacques Ergoulage, who studied him extensively, but little on this specific painting as opposed to Le Barbier's vast body of work. So this is why I did my own research and analysis. I combined my expertise on the French Revolution, and particularly of legal and intellectual history. And I delved into art history and the world of allegories and analysis of compositions. The result was peer-reviewed by art historians and specialists of the period in France and published in the Spanish journal Potestas, specializing in art history. Here is the link, which you can also link in the description below if you need further details or a reference for your publication. There is an important preliminary matter to highlight first. Today, we tend to dismiss images on and deny or immediately flag as suspicious any role they could play in shaping our knowledge. And even worse, today in our digital information age, when we are overwhelmed by a constant flux of images relayed by social media and which provenance can be hard to identify and dubious, and which content is easily manipulated or even invented by artificial intelligence. So we are told and raised with the view that only textual information can be trusted as a source of knowledge, and serious books do not contain images, perhaps not even on the cover. In any case, it should not be judged by it, unless, that is, I am on the cover. But this separation between image and text is a historically situated paradigm that can be traced back to the 19th century. Historians such as Fernando Bauza and Francis Yates have shown that the early modern period did not make a distinction between images, written words, and spoken words. All were considered as valid sources of knowledge, which is not to say that people did not make a difference between them, but that they could all be a source of information. The best example of this is any place of power, such as palaces or churches. A church is quite literally an open book, in this case the New Testament and sometimes the Old Testament. All paintings, frescoes, sculptures, stained glass windows, and even the architecture all tell stories and ideas from the Bible, which, by the way, means book. Moreover, Bauza and Yates point out that often the various media were intertwined, so an orator could speak using images, or a text would also be very visual and combine images, while images themselves could also include texts, as we've seen in the previous engravings. So speaking of books, in the early modern period, this was also the case for important works of philosophy. Philosophical concepts, and particularly political and legal concepts, would be represented by allegories. Very often, if not most of the time, philosophical treatises or pamphlets contained a frontispiece with an image illustrating the overall argument of the work, a little bit like today's blurb or abstract on the backside of the book. Famous example on the right here is Hobbes's frontispiece for De Quive. You probably know the famous image for his Leviathan, but this one, which he also had a hand in creating, has also been studied. On the left is an allegory of imperium, in Latin for authority, order, command, as opposed to libertas on the right, and behind them the results for each form of political regime on society, with a prosperous and industrious one under imperium and an anarchical and underdeveloped one behind libertas. So Hobbes's argument is famously against libertas, which is represented untraditionally here with the traits of a Native American, as illustrated in a contemporary work by Theodore de Brie for Thomas Harriot's report on the Newfoundland of Virginia, or in John Smith's account of Virginia. This represents Hobbes's argument that imperium, with the monarch symbolized in the crown, brings justice, with the balance symbolizing equality and executive power of decision, and the sword oriented towards the allegory necessary for a functioning society, while libertas is a natural state that lets the more powerful exercise power, leading to injustices and hence a lack of social development. Another famous work of political philosophy is on the left, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract. It was originally published with a frontispiece, combining with a quote from Virgil's Aeneid in Latin, Foederis aequas dicamus leges, and an allegorical image. The quote can be translated as, let us declare equal laws of the treaty or alliance, and the allegory represents liberty conquered by valor, as symbolized with the pike and the liberty hat on top of the pike, and the cat at her feet, but also holding the symbol of equality with the balance, and under the traits of Minerva, as shown with the helmet, armor, and pike. Minerva being the Roman goddess of justice, law, victory, and a bunch of other things that are relevant to the pamphlet's argument. So here is an opposite argument to Hobbes's, in which liberty is actually bringing order through laws and justice, although this liberty must be conquered. So now that we've established that images and written texts cannot be separated in terms of the weight of the philosophical argument, and that images with allegories and their composition represent philosophical systems, it is time to analyze the paintings attributed to Le Barbier and the engraving that he signed. The first thing to do after establishing the work's similarities and differences is to date them. The importance of dating the works serves to establish which one was first, second, and third, and hence consider the right evolution in the composition. It also serves to take the right historical context, which is always important, but particularly so in the context of the French Revolution, when things were happening literally from one day to another so fast that the context was completely different. The dating will help identify the context and hence the interpretation of the work. And so my argument is that there is indeed an earlier and a later version, and that one leans more towards a parliamentary republican interpretation of the political regime that the declaration entails, while the other one could still be situated in a constitutional monarchy with the king still playing an important role in this political regime. According to experts on Le Barbier, it can be said that the version on the left was the first one, because of the style of the painting as compared to other ones by Le Barbier. It is most certainly made by his own hand. The painting may have been executed very soon after the declaration, which was adopted between 20 and 26 August 1789. So the painting was perhaps made in early September 1789. What is certain is the date of the engraving, because it was presented officially at the National Assembly on 5 November 1789. Moreover, the engraving is signed by Le Barbier himself as author of the design, although not as engraver, and not as author of the explanatory text underneath. The painting based on the engraving was probably made after the engraving in late 1790 or early 1791. Given the similarity with the engraving, it is likely by Le Barbier, but the style is very different, the colors and the brush strokes, so it might have been made by a student of his rather than by his own hand. So we can make a distinction between version 1 and version 2 of the representations of the 1789 declaration. We can now turn to identifying the differences between the two paintings and the engraving. If you want to play along a game of Spot the Difference, you may pause the video and count all the difference you can notice. Are you ready? So we can note a number of differences between version 1 and 2. Version 1 is set in a natural setting where a massive monument seems to appear out of nowhere, dissipating clouds, with the two allegories surrounding it. Version 2 shows a close-up of the declarations and covering the entire monument, and the viewer can just distinguish in the background the sky and the dissipating clouds. In version 1, the text of the declaration is quite small. Actually, it's a collage and one of the first in art history. Le Barbier cut the text of the declaration printed on paper and simply glued it to the painting. In version 2, on the other hand, the text is the central piece and occupies most of the space, while the two allegories, who were bigger and more prominent in version 1, are now much smaller and serve as illustration. In the second version, the painting and the engraving are dedicated to the representatives of the French people. Let's remember that the engraving was officially presented and offered to the National Constituent Assembly. We can also notice that the colors are different between the two versions. Not just the palette of colors used for the painting, but also the clothes have different colors. While version 1 shows the two allegories wearing similar clothes with a white toga and blue cape, version 2 shows the left one in red and blue with a tint of white, while the right one is covered in a pink cape, mostly covering the white toga. The gaze of the right allegory is also different. While both versions show the left allegory looking at the right allegory, in version 1 the right allegory looks down, while in version 2 the allegory looks straight into the eyes of the viewer. Her scepter is also held and pointing to a different direction. In both versions, she points with her index towards the other allegory while holding the scepter. But in version 2, she's directing the scepter towards the eye in the triangle, while in version 1, it's not clearly pointing towards anything in particular. If you have noted the other elements, feel free to share them in the comments section. I would love to read them. So what can these differences tell about the meaning of the paintings? Well, if we have to imagine what must have been Le Barbier's creative process when designing a visual representation for the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, this was quite a unique and indeed historical event, and people at the time were keenly aware of the fact. A declaration of universal natural rights is also a new concept, even if there has been precedent with the English Bill of Rights and discussions in America that led to its own Bill of Rights. Natural rights as universal and declared were not precedented. So how to represent this legal document and its political history? Le Barbier had at his disposal the same visual vocabulary as philosophers had in a way. Neoclassicism, with its reference to antiquity, which in art relied on allegories and symbols to decode key figures and concepts. And on the other hand, the long tradition inherited from Christian art. We have to remember that religion with Christianity is still a central part of everything in society. So with these two traditions in mind, what elements from each can we decode in the painting? Let's start with the first version, and I will be moving a little bit up and down to make space in the frame. The eye inside a beaming triangle is a trope used in Christian art, which can be found in many churches and religious paintings. It represents the eye of providence, providence coming from the Latin word providentia, meaning foresight or foreknowledge or precaution. It represents the all-knowing being, or supreme being in the revolutionary vocabulary used in the text of the Declaration, that is God. Enlightenment philosophy developed the idea of natural rights as part of natural law, a source of law that is found in nature because it is of divine creation, and that can be deduced through human reason, which is a quality God gave to human beings. The all-seeing eye, or eye of providence, is there to reinforce the idea that natural rights stem from natural law as intended by God. Natural law and rights are universal since they are to be found everywhere and applied to all human beings. The image of dissipating clouds is one that is often used during the period of the Enlightenment as a symbol of the movement itself, the light of reason dissipating the clouds of ignorance. Now, for the left allegory, we have already seen that this is monarchical France. This way of portraying France as a country is present in many neoclassical paintings. The allegory of monarchical France is a woman with noble traits, wearing a crown symbolizing the monarchy, and here clothed with a blue cape adorned with yellow fleur-de-lis, which is the symbol used on the French coat of arms. Moreover, she is dressed in white, being the color of the monarchy, and more specifically of absolute monarchy. We can notice, however, that she's wearing a red bandana, which is a subtle reference to the political events that led to the declaration. Red is the color of Paris, which is where the revolution started with the storming of the Bastille on 14 July 1789, which became a symbol of liberty afterwards. This absolute monarchical France with a monarchical crown and a popular bandana on her head is symbolically breaking chains, symbolizing tyranny or the absence of liberty, in other words. She's looking at the other allegory as if inspired by her to break the chains. Now, what is the other allegory in question? By elimination, there are many possibilities which you can read in my printed article, but in fact, in the end, it is liberty. If we take the first and most famous book collecting emblems and allegories by Cesare Ripa, his Iconologia, published in 1593, without the illustrations, and with illustration in 1603. It was translated in almost all European languages and had many subsequent editions. It was highly influential in the 17th and 18th century, as it can be found in many libraries all around Europe. In this book, the allegory of liberty is described as such. I quote, "A young woman," because youth gives the freedom to do anything one wants, "holding a scepter in the right hand, the scepter representing power over oneself when one is free, and in the other hand, the hat of liberty, which was given to freed slaves in Roman antiquity. She's dressed in white, symbolizing all the possibilities of a white canvas, so to speak, and at her feet is often represented a cat, because cats, as we know, are notoriously reputed for doing whatever they damn please." A later addition to the iconography of liberty is the so-called liberty acquired by valor. This is to say liberty won after putting a fight for it. And here you can see she's still a young woman dressed in white, but she's holding a pike symbolizing the fight and with the cap of liberty on top. This is the symbol that is present in the painting inside the fasces. So from the neoclassical vocabulary, we can see that the figure is liberty, and by extension, liberty acquired by valor because of the pike with the liberty cap, although the cat is not present as in other paintings. However, that does not explain the wings. The wings can be explained both with reference to neoclassical art and Christian art. Within neoclassical art, the wings are a reference to a genius figure. Often a genius figure would inhabit a place and be a source of inspiration. In Christian art, the wings are associated with the figure of an angel, and the whole composition, much like the neoclassical genius inspiring figure, is reminiscent of the scene of the Annunciation. So here is an example with Van Eyck's triptych, where Gabrielle, holding a scepter, announces to the Virgin Mary that she is pregnant with the Son of God. Mary is typically represented reading the Bible. In parentheses, note how texts are included in the image with the book and also with the speech bubble that is coming out of their mouth. Many contemporary writers indeed compared the event of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizens as a divine annunciation. So what can we say about the meaning of the first version of the painting of the Declaration? This is a painting representing the events that led to the Declaration and what the Declaration means in some sort of instantaneous historical perspective. It tells the story of the apparition of the Declaration, a legal document for the ages akin to the Ten Commandments, when monarchical France, with the people of Paris as historical actors, is inspired by the genius figure of liberty to fight against tyranny and break her chains, hereby acquiring liberty by valor. The enlightened people, using reason, declared those natural rights that stem from divine natural law and by which human laws should abide. There are then other elements which we are going to see after looking at the second version and how its interpretation differs from this one. Just first, a quick reminder of the differences between version 1 and 2 and the engraving. The natural setting disappears, the text becomes central while the allegories are mainly illustrative. The whole is dedicated to the representatives in the National Assembly. The figures have different colors. The right allegory points with her scepter towards the eye of Providence and is directly looking at the viewer. The representation of France and her actions varies in colors and hence on the emphasis of the actors moving France. In the first one, it is clearly France as absolute monarchy, with red bandana under the crown as a minor part of the action of breaking the chains. But in the second version, which is not visible in the engraving, as the engraving has no color, France is dressed in red and blue, the colors of Paris, and the crown is a reminder that the head of state is a king of Bourbon, one as the fleur-de-lis still represents for the French coat of arms. So it is more prominent that the people of Paris was the motor for France to break the chain of tyranny, rather than the monarchy. Although France is still a monarchy, but with less emphasis on the role of the king in the second version. Putting the right allegory in version 1 and 2 next to each other, what differences do you see? And what do you think this means when we know that the visual vocabulary is closely related to the philosophical one? Bear in mind that version 1 is probably from around September 1789, while version 2 was painted after November 1790. You may want to pause here the video to take a closer look and leave your answers in the comments below. I'd love to read it. The allegory on the right is wearing different clothes, which sets it apart from the allegory of France, and hence casts a doubt on its simple genius function inhabiting the country, as it seems to be a figure on her own. Moreover, she has less attributes related to the allegory of liberty. She does not seem to be the same youthful figure as Liberty traditionally is, and she's wearing more pink than white. Also, her left hand seems to be pointing differently with her index. If we zoom in on her face, we can see that she has more mature traits. If we look at the direction of the arms, we can see that the scepter points directly at the eye of Providence, while the index on the other arm is pointing down at the text of the declaration and not at the Liberty Cap. Her gaze is also directed at the spectator, which is the National Assembly, to which the painting is dedicated. All of these details start to cast doubt as to the identity of the allegory as liberty, as genius figure accompanying monarchical France. Comparing side by side, we see that version 1 does not point the scepter towards the eye of Providence, thus reinforcing the interpretation that this is the allegory of liberty with the scepter representing power over oneself when one is free. The index points towards the Liberty Cap on top of the pike, also reinforcing the hypothesis that this is the allegory of liberty, hinting at the trope of liberty conquered by valor. She has the youthful traits of the face and is wearing predominantly white. Also, her gaze is down, making the viewer look at the declaration in which liberty is indeed a central element as one of the natural rights by birth. So what interpretation can we give of the second version then? First, the fact that the declaration is placed at the center and takes up most of the space shows that this is not an illustration of the historical conditions and origins of the declaration, but only the declaration itself with a discrete reference to its origins and legal source, and a symbolic explanation of what political and legal consequences it entails. As the engraving states, the right figure is the law, and since she is a winged allegory, we have to interpret it as the genius of the law. This interpretation is reinforced by other elements, such as the fact that the engraving on which the painting is based, as a more permanent colored copy, is dedicated to the representatives of the French people, meaning the deputies elected at the National Assembly who are drafting the text of the Constitution. The Assembly was divided at the time between a left and a right, with the left more in favor of democracy and the right hostile to the revolution, and the middle in favor of a British model of a constitutional monarchy and a House of Lords and House of Commons. In other words, the battle in constitutional terms is about who is the legitimate sovereign and who exercises power between a king appointed by divine right, an assembly of aristocrats by birth, and an assembly elected by the citizen. If the allegory on the right changes from liberty to law, even as a genius figure, it has tremendous consequences, because now the law holds the scepter of power, and the painting can be read as a legitimization of the body that passes law as true sovereign power. Monarchical France is idly looking at the law, almost passively, although it broke the chains of tyranny. The allegory of the law is directly gazing at the viewer, and since the painting is dedicated to the representatives, it is a message to them that they are the legitimate sovereign power as long as they respect these rights pointed down, which are an incarnation of natural law. The two paintings are therefore a visual demonstration of the rapid evolution of the political situation in France and the evolution of political and legal concepts. On the left, the immediate aftermath of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in late August 1789. It is an allegorical story of how monarchical France, inspired by the genius of liberty, broke the chains of tyranny in an act of valor, the Parisian events, and declared the rights of man and the citizen, too long ignored from divine natural law. These rights came like a modern annunciation of new commandments for society and its political bodies. The Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail, symbolizes the sempiternal quality of these universal rights. The fascist reminds of ancient republican Rome with its magistrates defended by lictors, or the need to have a legitimated public force defending the legal basis of society. The second version of late 1790 or early 1791 depicts a different conception, anchored in a different context. Dedicated to the representatives of the people, it is a political message with a clear interpretation of the legitimate sovereign in France based on natural law and natural rights. It is both puzzling and very telling that the text identifies the left allegory as France without mention of monarchy, despite the crown on her head and the fleur-de-lis cape that symbolize both the French monarchy, and the right as law. The reason for describing the allegory as law might be that the political events changed as the revolution accelerated between the first painting on the left from September 1789 and the engraving of 5 November 1790, on which the second painting of the rights is based. On 22 September 1789, the National Assembly decreed that while France was still a monarchy, no one was above the law, not even the king, who could only demand obedience from his subjects in terms of the law. So the concept of the law as embodying the concept of the nation is competing with the king as embodying the nation. The nation of French citizens constitute France as an abstract, but the legitimate power governing France is split between the king on the one hand and the lawmaking body, that is the assembly, on the other. To support this argument, one can look at another engraving entitled Le Serment Fédératif from July 1790 by an anonymous author. On 14 July 1790, for the first celebration of the Federation, the king had to swear an oath of fealty to both the nation and the law. This engraving represents this oath, but the king does not even appear. He is simply represented as a fleur-de-lis, surrounded by the text of his oath, while allegories of Minerva for sciences, Mercury for trade, and Apollo for the arts are also shown swearing an oath. Above, Fame holds a banner with Vive la Nation and Vive la Loi, while another, Angel, holds one with Vive le Roi, thus making a separation between the two groups in a paradoxical vision of federation. Le Barbier's visualization of the Declaration of Rights will inspire other representations. For instance, on the left here, an anonymous engraving of the Declaration of 1795. The text of the declaration is set between two columns, each topped with an allegorical figure. The left figure is a naked woman with wings and a flame above her head, holding a pike topped by a Phrygian hat in her right hand, a book under her left arm, and a rooster at her feet. She stands on top of a column representing the storming of the Bastille, and the explanation below describes it as the French genius of liberty. It is a female representation despite being a genius, as symbolized by the wings and the flame instead of a diadem. And it is liberty conquered by valor, which, while the rooster is symbolizing France. On the other side, Hercules stands on top of the column symbolizing the events of August 10th, 1792, the attack on the Tuileries Palace where the king resided, which sealed the fate of monarchy for a republic. The engraving on the right was designed by Desrets in 1793 and engraved by Blanchard. It reiterates the design of the two tables, like the commandments given to Moses, and the text of the 1793 Declaration of Rights is inscribed in both tables. Above, there is this same all-seeing eye from which rays dissipates the clouds, but the design is overcrowded with symbols and allegories. It looks like a summary of all possible interpretations and political concepts of the revolution just packed into one drawing. France as Minerva on the right, a topless woman holding a mirror, intensifying the rays of light coming from the eye of providence. In the middle represents truth. The allegory of time on the left is burned by the light. Below, a compass, a hat on a pike, fasces, Hercules' club, an axe, a shovel, pillars, Marat, Le Pelletier, and other figures of the French Revolution. The woman holding the compass may be equality alone or natural law together with the woman holding the mirror. In Cesare Ripa's 1618 Italian edition of Iconologia, natural law is represented as a half-naked woman in a garden holding a compass over the Latin motto Aequa Lance, wield in fairness. Throughout the revolution and in the following turbulent decades of consolidation of the Republic, various allegories will symbolize France, from liberty to law or justice, to Hercules, Minerva, truth, time or equality, and finally settling on Marianne, which remained until today, wearing the Liberty Cap. You can read more on this in this excellent study by Maurice Aguillon, which is also translated into English. If you'd like to know more, you can read my article published in the peer-reviewed journal Potestas, dedicated to art history. And you're welcome to contact me on my homepage for any collaboration or question, or if you're interested in other aspects of my work. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you now have a better understanding of this very famous painting and what it represents and the political concepts.